It started with silence, the kind of silence that presses on your chest and makes it hard to breathe, the kind that feels louder than shouting. She was used to that silence, she had learned to survive inside it, to lower her eyes, to slow her steps, to make herself small so no one would notice how tired she was, how much she carried inside. She worked in a house so large that her footsteps echoed, yet no one ever seemed to hear her, a house owned by a man whose name opened doors, whose money bent rules, whose power wrapped around him like armor, and to him, she was just another shadow passing through his halls, another employee who should be grateful, quiet, replaceable. She had come to this job after everything else fell apart, after promises were broken, after dignity became something she folded away just to survive. She cleaned his floors, served his meals, stood silently as his guests laughed, and swallowed the looks, the comments, the small humiliations that no one ever apologized for. Every day felt heavy, and yet she endured, because endurance was all she had left. The first time he noticed her was not because of her work, but because she dared to pause, just for a second, when he spoke sharply behind her. He hated pauses, he hated delays, he hated being reminded that other people existed beyond his will. He snapped at her, his voice cold, sharp, practiced in command, and she immediately bowed her head, apologized softly, and moved again, her heart pounding, her face burning, sadness settling deeper inside her. But she said nothing, she always said nothing. Days passed like that, slow and exhausting. His presence filled every room, arrogant, untouchable, surrounded by people who laughed too loudly at his jokes and agreed too quickly with his opinions, and she watched from the edges, invisible, absorbing everything, learning his moods, his habits, the way power made people careless, the way arrogance made them blind. One evening, something changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, the way real turning points often arrive. The house was hosting a private gathering, powerful guests, important names, security everywhere, tension thick in the air. She was assigned to clean the lower level, out of sight, out of mind, and she welcomed that. The distance felt safer, calmer, but as she worked, she heard voices above her, footsteps moving closer, and then suddenly, a door opened, light spilled down, and the millionaire himself descended the steps, arguing on his phone, his voice low but furious, his confidence unshaken, until he saw her, and irritation flashed across his face. He hated being seen in moments he didn't control. He gestured sharply, ordering her to leave, but before she could move, a loud sound echoed above them, confusion erupted, shouting, running footsteps, and in that instant, everything broke apart. Security rushed, lights flickered, chaos replaced control, and without thinking, without planning, she reacted. She pulled him down, fast, firm, covering his mouth, pressing him into the shadows beneath the stairs, her gloved hand tight, her voice close to his ear, barely louder than breath, and she whispered, "Stay silent." In that moment, the powerful man felt something he hadn't felt in years, fear, raw and unfiltered. His heart raced, his mind screamed to command, to push, to shout, but her grip didn't tremble, her eyes didn't beg, they warned, and he obeyed, stunned by the reversal, by the fact that someone like her dared to control the moment. They stayed there as security rushed past, as voices shouted names, as danger hovered close enough to feel, and she stayed calm, her breathing steady, her focus sharp, because fear was something she had lived with for a long time. She knew how to move inside it. When it was over, when silence returned, she released him and stepped back immediately, lowering her eyes again, retreating into herself, expecting anger, punishment, dismissal, but instead, there was something else in the air, something unsettled. He stared at her, not with arrogance, not with dismissal, but with confusion, with the first crack in his certainty, and she felt her sadness return, heavier now, because moments like that never changed things for people like her. They were forgotten, buried, erased. He said nothing then, turned away, and left, and she returned to her work, her hands shaking slightly now that the danger had passed, helplessness creeping in, reminding her of her place, reminding her not to hope. That night, she lay awake in her small room, replaying everything, wondering if she had crossed a line, if tomorrow she would be gone, her job erased with a single word. She felt small again, powerless, trapped in a system that never forgave people without influence, and yet, beneath the fear, something else flickered, quiet, fragile, hope, not loud enough to trust, not strong enough to name, but there, refusing to die completely. The next morning, she reported to work as usual, her posture calm, her expression neutral, prepared for the worst, but the day passed strangely, no summons, no punishment, no cold dismissal. Instead, she noticed subtle changes, fewer sharp orders, eyes lingering longer, whispers among staff, and she stayed patient, silent, observing, because patience had always been her shield. Days turned into weeks, and he began to watch her, quietly, thoughtfully, noticing her consistency, her restraint, the way she carried herself despite the weight she bore, and something inside him shifted, slowly, reluctantly, as he began to see the injustice woven into his own world, the cruelty normalized by power, the way he had treated people like her without consequence. Still, he said nothing, and she expected nothing, because expecting had once broken her, so she worked, endured, waited, unaware that the silence between them was no longer empty, it was changing, and the moment she whispered stay silent beneath the stairs had planted something neither of them could undo. The silence between them grew heavier with each passing day, not loud, not dramatic, but thick enough to feel. She sensed it when she entered rooms, when conversations paused for half a second too long, when eyes followed her and then quickly looked away. She kept her head down, because attention had never brought her anything good, and yet, something inside her had shifted, a small awareness that she could not unfeel. The millionaire changed in ways no one could openly explain. He became quieter, sharper in observation, less careless with his words, but more dangerous in thought, because powerful men rarely change without reason, and everyone around him felt it, including her. He began calling her name, softly, not as an order but as a request, and each time it happened her chest tightened, sadness brushing against fear, because requests from men like him often came with invisible prices. The first time he asked her to bring him tea personally, the room felt too large, too empty. His eyes followed every movement she made, not with desire, not with cruelty, but with something unsettled, something searching, and she placed the cup down, murmured the proper words, and stepped back, waiting to be dismissed, but he didn't dismiss her. Instead he asked, "Why did you do it?" His voice calm, controlled, as if asking about the weather. She froze, helplessness washing over her, because truth had never been safe, and lies required confidence she didn't have, so she chose the smallest answer. "I reacted, sir, nothing more," and she expected him to scoff, too. Mock her simplicity, but he didn't. He leaned back, silent, studying her as if she were a puzzle that refused to fit the frame he had built for the world. He dismissed her then, and she left with shaking hands, patience pulling her forward, reminding her that survival meant restraint. Over the next weeks, he tested her without announcing it, small situations, sudden questions, unexpected pressure, watching how she responded, how she stayed calm, how she never raised her voice, never begged, never tried to impress, and slowly, his arrogance began to crack, not into kindness, but into awareness. She learned things she never wanted to know, overheard conversations, saw documents left carelessly on desks, glimpsed the machinery of influence and manipulation that kept men like him untouchable, and each discovery made her quieter, not louder, because she understood now how fragile truth was in a world built on power. One afternoon, a guest insulted her openly, laughed as if she were furniture that spoke out of turn, and everyone waited for the millionaire to react, but he didn't. He watched her instead, measured her response, and she bowed her head, absorbed the humiliation, and walked away, sadness pressing down on her chest like a weight she had carried for years. That night, he couldn't sleep. The image of her lowered eyes haunted him, because for the first time, he saw humiliation not as weakness, but as something inflicted, something chosen by those who could afford cruelty. The next morning, he summoned her again, this time with others present, and he apologized to her, briefly, formally, without drama, and the room went still, shock rippling through people who had never seen him apologize to anyone, and she stood frozen, helplessness colliding with quiet hope, because apologies from powerful men were rare, and often meaningless, but this one felt different, restrained, uncomfortable, real. After that, changes came slowly, policies shifted, staff treated differently, voices lowered, fear softened into uncertainty, and she remained patient, watching, waiting, unsure if this was transformation or another illusion designed to protect his image. She never asked for favors, never pushed for recognition, because patience had taught her that justice rushed was justice broken, and yet, the world around her continued to bend, subtly, gradually, as if something unseen was being corrected from the inside. Then came the day everything threatened to collapse again. Accusations surfaced, powerful enemies moved, secrets leaked, and the man who once seemed untouchable found himself surrounded by danger of a different kind, legal, reputational, irreversible, and once again, he found himself looking at her, not as an employee, not as a tool, but as someone who had seen him at his weakest and remained silent. He asked her then, directly, what she thought he should do, and for the first time, she spoke without fear, without anger, with calm honesty, telling him that power without accountability always collapses, that silence can protect, but truth heals, and her words landed not as judgment, but as guidance. That moment marked the end of helplessness and the beginning of something else, something fragile but real, the slow approach of justice, not loud, not violent, but steady, built on patience, integrity, and the courage to change, and she stood at the center of it quietly, still underestimated, still overlooked, but no longer invisible. The pressure began to close in from all sides, not suddenly, but steadily, like walls moving inward inch by inch, the kind of pressure that exposes who people really are, and she felt it everywhere now, in the whispers of staff, in the careful smiles of executives, in the way doors closed more quietly than before. The millionaire's world was no longer stable, and everyone knew it, even if no one dared say it out loud. She stayed where she always had been, working, observing, saying little, because patience had become her strength, and silence her armor, yet inside her, quiet hope grew stronger, not naive, not desperate, but grounded, earned. Investigations began, formal ones, official ones, the kind that power could delay but not fully erase, and the arrogant man who once ruled rooms with a glance now found himself listening more than speaking, calculating every move, every word, and through it all, he watched her, noticing how she remained unchanged, how injustice had never hardened her into bitterness. One evening, he asked her to stay after her shift, the request calm, respectful, and fear flickered briefly inside her, old memories stirring, but she stayed, because running had never saved her before. He spoke openly then, not as a superior, but as a man cornered by consequences. He admitted mistakes without dramatics, without excuses, and in his voice there was something new, humility shaped by necessity, but real nonetheless, and she listened, sadness mixing with understanding, because she knew too well how systems crushed people until they were forced to see clearly. He asked her why she never spoke up, why she endured humiliation in silence, and she answered simply, because speaking without power only adds pain, and her words stayed with him long after she left the room. As weeks passed, testimonies were taken, documents reviewed, alliances shifted, and the world he had built on untouchability began to fracture, not collapse, but crack enough to let light through, and through it all, she remained steady, patient, watching justice approach slowly, the way it always did when it was real. Others began to notice her too, not as a servant, but as a presence, someone whose calm carried weight, whose silence suggested depth, and still, she asked for nothing, because dignity did not need permission. Then came the public moment, the one everyone feared, a hearing, cameras flashing, reporters waiting for scandal, and the millionaire stood there, exposed in a way money could not fix, and for the first time, he chose not to hide, not to crush, not to silence, he told the truth, not all of it, not perfectly, but enough to change the narrative, enough to accept responsibility, and the shock rippled outward, disbelief turning into cautious respect. Behind the scenes, consequences followed, titles lost, influence reduced, but not destroyed, and in the quiet aftermath, he called her again, thanking her, not dramatically, not emotionally, but sincerely, acknowledging that her silence had not been weakness, but wisdom. For her, justice did not arrive as applause or reward, but as restoration, better working conditions, fair treatment, respect that no longer needed to be demanded, and something even rarer, the return of self-worth she thought she had lost forever. She felt sadness ease its grip, helplessness fade into memory, quiet hope settle into confidence, patience transform into peace, and when she looked at him now, she did not see a villain or a hero, just a man changed by a moment he never expected. A moment when a quiet employee whispered "Stay silent," and the world shifted. Still, the story was not finished, because true justice is not about endings, it is about what continues after the noise fades, and in the final days of that chapter, she made a choice of her own, one that would define everything that followed, not for him, but for herself, stepping forward calmly, ready to claim a future shaped not by fear, but by truth. The final shift came quietly, the way all lasting changes do, without applause, without announcements, just a steady sense that something old had ended and something new had begun. She felt it the morning she woke up and realized her chest no longer felt tight, her breath no longer shallow, the sadness that once lived inside her had softened into memory, no longer ruling her days. She arrived at work and noticed how people spoke to her differently now, not carefully, not fearfully, but with respect, genuine and unforced, and she accepted it without pride, because she knew how fragile dignity could be. The millionaire, no longer untouchable, no longer surrounded by blind loyalty, stood in a quieter version of his world, stripped of excess but grounded in reality, and when he saw her, he nodded, not as a superior, but as an equal in humanity, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had both survived. She made a decision that day, not driven by anger, not by revenge, but by clarity. She resigned, calmly, respectfully, choosing herself for the first time, choosing a future where her silence would be her choice, not her prison. He tried to stop her, not with power, not with money, but with understanding, asking her to stay, offering growth, opportunity, recognition, and she listened patiently, grateful, but firm, because justice had already done its work, and now it was time to move forward. She walked out of that house without fear, without bitterness, carrying something she had never carried before, peace, earned through patience, strengthened by hope, validated by truth. In the weeks that followed, her story quietly spread, not as gossip, not as scandal, but as example, a reminder that strength does not always shout, that justice does not always strike loudly, and that sometimes, the smallest voice can change the direction of the most powerful lives. She found work where her calm was valued, where her integrity mattered, and when she spoke now, people listened, because her words were never wasted. And somewhere else, in a world that no longer bowed as easily, a former arrogant man continued rebuilding, guided forever by the memory of a quiet employee who once whispered "Stay silent," and in doing so, changed everything, not by force, not by confrontation, but by patience, courage, and the power of quiet justice.